Thank you, and it's wonderful to see you all here this morning, bright and early. I'm assuming Saturday morning traffic in Bangalore is a little more manageable than perhaps yesterday afternoon was, so you were all able to get here in time. During his very witty and wise remarks yesterday, Shah Rukh Khan began with an IIM joke. So I thought I'd also start by telling you an IIM joke. It seems that one day, somewhere on your, I'm told, very attractive campus, an IIM male student was walking by some sort of pond and it was a quiet day, you know, blue sky, green trees, breeze soughing in the air, absolutely no one around. And suddenly he heard a voice saying, "Kiss me." So he looked around, and there was nothing around but a frog at the edge of the pond. And the frog said, "Kiss me and I'll turn into a beautiful princess." So the IIM student apparently bent down, picked up the frog, put it into his pocket and kept on walking. So the plaintive cries came out from the pocket, "Kiss me, kiss me." And the IIM graduate wasn't doing anything. Finally, very plaintively, they was, "Aren't you going to kiss me and turn me into a beautiful princess?" So the IIM student takes out the frog from his pocket, looks at it sternly and says, "I'm studying at IIM Bangalore. I don't have time for a girlfriend, but a talking frog is cool." Well, I'm delighted to be present here amongst the distinguished alumni of IIM Bangalore, the executives and managers of several of our best-known companies, to speak on India in today's networked world. You know, I nearly had a personal connection to all of you because way back in the misty history of 1975, I actually sat the entrance exams to the only two IIMs in the country at that time, and I came first in the Calcutta rankings and second in Ahmedabad. But I chose instead to push off to the States and study international affairs, and somehow that has given me a very different life from what you've all had. Had I taken up that offer, perhaps I would have been an alumnus too and entitled to be here in my own right, rather than merely as a speaker. But anyway, life had a global path chalked out for me. And when I left, obviously, globalization was barely a buzzword. But today, there's no escaping it. And in many ways, my own life has been an example of it. A Malayali kid born in London, raised in Mumbai, Calcutta, and Delhi, studied in the US, worked all across the world in Europe and Southeast Asia, and then ended up back in India, sort of globalization coming full circle. In some ways, as I was setting out to talk about globalization, I was reminded of one more dreadful story, given that all of you seem to appreciate the first one. This isn't original. It came around the internet some years ago during the anniversary of the tragic death of Princess Diana. And I don't know if you remember all this, but you might well say, what's that got to do with globalization? Well, think of it this way. An English princess with a Welsh title leaves a French hotel with an Egyptian companion who has supplanted a Pakistani. She gets into a German car with a Dutch engine and is driven by a Belgian chauffeur full of Scottish liquid. They are then chased by Italian paparazzi on Japanese motorcycles into a Swiss-built tunnel where they crash. A rescue is briefly attempted by an American doctor using Brazilian medicines, and the whole story is now being told to you in Bangalore by an Indian MP from Thiruvananthapuram. There's globalization. Okay, so my first point today is that there's no escaping globalization. And before I start enumerating the points, let me say as a student of history, I'm very conscious of the fact that during the First World War, when American President Woodrow Wilson came up with his famous 14 points to end the war, the French President Georges Clemenceau was reported to have remarked privately, 14 points, even the good Lord only needed 10. So, having no pretensions to competing with the good Lord, I'm going to try and keep mine to 9. But let me offer you 9 pointers on what today's network world is all about. So the first one is, as I said, there's no escaping globalization. And even in India, this has become true. But remember that for us, self-reliance and economic self-sufficiency were a mantra for more than 4 decades after independence, and there were real doubts as to whether the country should open itself further to the world economy. Whereas in the Western world, America, and perhaps in your circles today, most people associate capitalism with freedom. Don't forget that Indian nationalists associated capitalism with slavery. Why? Because the British East India Company had come to trade and stayed on to rule. And so our nationalist movement was not only about kicking the British out, but they saw every foreigner with a briefcase as the thin end of a new imperial wedge. You know, they were saying they were coming here to trade or invest, but their real agenda is to rule you. Which sort of kind of proves that one of the lessons you can learn from history is that history sometimes teaches you the wrong lessons. So instead of opening up to the global economy, as only a handful of post-colonial countries like Singapore chose to do, India's leaders and those of most of the former colonies were convinced that their political independence could only be guaranteed by economic independence. So self-reliance became the slogan, the protectionist barriers went up, and India spent about 45 years with bureaucrats rather than businessmen running the commanding heights of the Indian economy, wasting in many ways, or at least spending those first 4.5 decades after independence in subsidizing unproductivity, regulating stagnation, and trying to distribute poverty. So it's important to appreciate the extent of the paradigm shift that occurred in 1991, because the shift in thinking that was required for a country like India to give up the cherished assumptions of its independence movement and chart a new course. And it took a financial crisis of terrific proportions in 1991. You remember our gold being shipped off to London to stand guarantee for an IMF loan. Now this change seems truly irreversible, because in those last 24 years since 1991, we've had governments of every political stripe imaginable, and at the same time, none of them has reversed the achievements of liberalization or worked to reduce or remove the global connectedness of the Indian economy. So what does it mean to be a young person, let's say a college student or a graduate student in Bangalore today at IIM perhaps? Well, IIM, of course, they're all residents, but let's say that kind of institution. It can mean waking up to an alarm clock made in Taiwan or Hong Kong, downing a cup of tea from leaves first planted by the British, donning jeans designed in America and taking a Japanese scooter or even a small Korean car to get to an Indian college, where your textbooks might be printed with German-invented technology on paper first pulped in Sweden. You might call your friends on a Finnish, or these days much more likely a Chinese-made mobile phone, to invite them to an Italian pizza, or even what you think of as an Indian meal, featuring naan that came to us from Persia, tandoori chicken taught to us by rulers from Uzbekistan, and aloo and hari mirch that first came to India only 400 years ago from Latin America, with the Portuguese and the Spanish. And the most desi thing, of course, is suspicion of anything foreign. Now, in such a world, issues that seem very far away are very much in your backyard. What happens in East Asia or South Africa, from protectionist policies to deforestation to desertification to the fight against AIDS, can affect your lives wherever you live here in South India. And your choices anywhere, what you buy, how you vote, can resound far away. As someone once said about water pollution, we all live downstream. We are all interconnected, and we can no longer afford the luxury of not thinking about the rest of the planet in anything we do. Second point, there is a paradox at the heart of our globalized new world. When we think about the forces of globalization irresistibly transforming our world, we also think of the information technology revolution that brings to our breakfast tables and our living rooms, our computers and our mobile phones, snippets of information and glimpses of events from every corner of the globe. These are forces of convergence, which have made the world one village, one market, one audience. But the opposite also exists. We have to think about the changes that terrorism and conflict have also wrought in the world. The aftermath of 9/11 and the war on terror, the rise in violent manifestations of intolerance, and of course the wars in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and elsewhere. These are the forces of disruption. that threaten to create new divisions between haves and have-nots, between North and South, between peoples of different religions, cultures, creeds. In other words, the very forces that through globalization are pulling us together seem at the very same time, through international terrorism, to be pushing us apart. I mean, there's an amazing thought that in 9/11 in America, 2011, a fire that started in a dusty cave in a forgotten corner, one corner of the global village, was strong enough to melt the steel girders holding up the tallest skyscrapers at the opposite corner of the global village. Now the terrible notion of a clash of civilizations has entered our discourse as the previously benign forces of religion, culture, and society have become causes of conflict in many places rather than of succor. So living with this paradox is at the heart of the edginess, as it were, of our brave new world. Third, globalization doesn't flow in only one direction. You know, when the Indian industrialist Jamshedji Tata was denied admission to Pike's Hotel in Bombay in the 1890s, at the peak of the British Empire, he built a far grander, more opulent hotel that was open to Indians, because Pike's was not open to Indians and dogs, you see. So the Taj Mahal Hotel was built. I'm sorry to discuss a competitor under the hospitable roof of the Leela, but the Taj is today considered one of the finest hotels in the world, whereas Pike's has long since closed. And when the same Mr. Tata set up India's first steel mill, in the face of implacable British hostility in 1905, a senior imperial official actually remarked that he would personally eat every ounce of steel that an Indian was capable of producing. And how I wish he'd lived long enough to see the day when Tata, the descendants of that same Mr. Tata, bought up the remnants of British steel when they acquired Corus. Might have given him a bad case of indigestion. And I wonder what he would have felt when Indians gleefully sent around the internet this summer photographs of the British Prime Minister going to Buckingham Palace to claim his renewed mandate in an Indian-owned car, the Jaguar, right? So, escorted, by the way, by the police in another Indian-owned car, a Land Rover, but that's another story. I hope it sent a post-colonial frisson through you, though, when you saw that. But my point is not just these anecdotes. It's to say that it's time to set aside the old stereotypes of who can and cannot excel in our globalizing world. The smartest executive jets are made by Embraer of Brazil today. The tallest building in the world is currently in Dubai, which overtook the previous tallest building in Taipei, which in turn supplanted one in Kuala Lumpur. The world's biggest plane is being built in Russia and Ukraine. The Challenger to the Panama Canal, which is now cutting through Nicaragua, is being built by the Chinese. The biggest shopping mall in the world is in Beijing. And the country with the highest per capita income is not the United States, but Singapore. In fact, 30 years ago, every single one of these categories that I mentioned to you would have been headed by the United States. So what has happened is, yes, the US still remains the world's sole superpower, but others are catching up fast in various areas where it alone had been dominant. So where it was number one in everything, now it's number one in a few things, and others are number one in different things. It's not so much the decline of the West as the rise of the rest. But growth projections for Brazil, Russia, India, and China, the BRICS countries, indicate that they will collectively match the original G7's share of global GDP by 2040, even if they're wrong by 10 years, by 2050. So that era of US dominance is conclusively coming to an end. A different example, a couple of decades ago, no one would have mentioned India and high technology in the same breath. I don't know how many of you here are of that vintage, but Kiran and I will remember the time. I went off to graduate school in America in '75, and the fact is that by then the migration of Indian engineers from the 60s onwards was still incipient, still gathering steam. But now that lot has created a wholly new perception of India amongst the Americans with whom they work. They, of course, had a solid grounding in the IITs, some in the IIMs as well. They excelled in the freedom afforded to them by the US system, which they didn't have in India. And then what happened? An Indian invented the Pentium chip, another Indian created Hotmail, a third started or co-started Sun Microsystems, and Indians have been involved in some 40% of all the startups in California's Silicon Valley. Over time, the Indianness of engineers and software developers has begun to be taken as synonymous with mathematical and scientific excellence. Today, Americans speak of the IITs with the same reverence they used to accord to MIT. The image of India has changed from the image I encountered when I first went to America, that of a backward developing country, fakirs lying on beds of nails, snake charmers doing the Indian rope trick. You know, that was the classic image. To a new stereotype now of sophisticated land full of mathematical geeks producing computer engineers and scientists and computer experts and software people and world-class managers by the dozens. Now, of course, sometimes this is unintended consequences. I've often told the story of meeting an Indian a few years ago while transiting through Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, who told me, and he was like me, a history honors student or something, and he told me with amusement of how this anxiously perspiring European had approached him at the airport and said, you're Indian, can you help me fix my laptop? So that's the other side of the story. Fourth, our new millennium is a time for diversity. I mentioned earlier the Huntington thesis in 1996 of the clash of civilizations. I think he was wrong. The civilizations are not monoliths, and each of the civilizations he analyzed actually has a great deal of diversity within it. And religion and culture are merely amongst the many variables governing the actions and policies of states. For example, many states which have a religion in common may have differences amongst them. For example, we have to consider the contrasting positions taken by different Islamic states over the Taliban in Afghanistan, you know, where Iran stands, where Saudi Arabia, their UAE stood, or similarly the differences amongst them on Syria, on Iran, and so on, to illustrate the point. But the leaders of tomorrow will have to know both how to live with change in a varied world and how to live with contradictions. I mean, that is, so though Huntington may have been wrong, there is a process taking place, there is change, there are contradictions, there is difference, which can be managed, which is not as simplistic as Huntington's thesis implies, but which requires you as leaders, and we're supposed to be at a leadership summit, being conscious of it. I mean, you know, when we talk about India too, the old joke about our country is that anything I can tell you about India, the opposite is also true. So we like to think of ourselves as an ancient civilization, but we are also a young republic. Our IT experts are striding confidently forward in the 21st century, but the majority of our population still lives in each of the 20 other centuries. Quite often, however, the opposites coexist quite cheerfully. One of my favorite images of India, I'm sorry I keep citing the internet as often as this, but many of you may have seen it. It zinged around the internet at the time of the last Kumbh Mela. And it was a picture of a naked Hindu sadhu, right out of central casting. The upper body completely bare, ash-smeared torso, scraggly unwashed hair, gaps in his teeth, this little wispy beard, warts on his face, a Rudraksha mala around his neck. And he's staring into the distance for all you may think a cliched picture of timeless otherworldliness, except for one detail. In this photograph, this naked sadhu is chatting away on a mobile phone. Now that is the image of India that, in fact, I actually wanted my publishers to use it on the cover of one of my books, and they said, no, it's become a cliche. But the fact is, cliches are often cliches because they're true. And you as leaders have to be aware that you're functioning in a world where a naked Hindu holy man comfortably uses a cell phone, and learn to embrace both the possibilities and the complications that represents. One of the paradoxes of our globalizing world is that if the 20th century, in the phrase that became popular in the First World War, has made the world safe for democracy, then the 21st century, the challenge for us now is to make a world safe for diversity. And by the way, that's a challenge at home as well, that I'm not here to talk politics. Fact is, the world as a whole must reflect the idea that is already familiar to multi-ethnic democracies like India and America, that it shouldn't matter what the color of your skin is, the kind of food you eat, the sounds you make when you speak, the God you choose to worship or not, so long as you want to play by the same rules as everybody else and dream the same dreams. It is not essential in a democratic world to agree all the time, so long as we agree on the ground rules of how we will disagree. The author Benjamin Barber has written of the twin prospects facing humanity as what he calls jihad versus mech world. And I'll quote him for a minute. Jihad in the name of 100 narrowly conceived faiths against technology, against pop culture, against integrated markets, against modernity itself, unquote, versus a mech world of globalization run rampant, a world of fast music, fast computers, fast food, fast cars, with MTV, Macintosh, and McDonald's all pressing nations into one commercially homogeneous theme park. Now, of course, the problem is that both jihad and mech world end up by obliterating our most precious possession, which is our identity, our own sense of what makes us special, our distinctive individual personas. We need to strive for a world in which we can preserve our individual identities and yet work in cooperation with each other. The only solution is to fight for diversity. But fifth, the new network world is seeing the rise of old problems. We think of religious wars and crusades as relics of medieval history, yet they've come back to haunt us in the second decade of the 21st century, as we've seen with the rise of ISIS and Daesh. Well, ISIS is Daesh. Now, why do so many political grievances, real or imagined, get articulated in religious terms? We're seeing the same phenomenon in our country. The answer surely lies in the primordial nature of religious identity. See, as a writer, I'm attracted to what one might call the cultural construct of identity, of which religion is only a part, and to many not even the most important part. But when other avenues of identity mobilization are either restricted, which happens in autocratic states, or difficult in societies where political patterns are entrenched and admit few interlopers, then ordinary people tend to fall back on the one identity that seems to them to be basic, and that's often, usually, religion. In India, it's also sometimes caste. We can worry about that later. Sometimes in our country, when you cast your vote, you vote your caste. But now religion is being hammered into our heads in our public discourse. Now, you take a secular intellectual like Amartya Sen, or for that matter myself, we may give equal weight to the tag of being a cricket fan, or in my case, a Stephanian, in his case, an Oxbridge Don, give equal weight to that as to that of being born in a Hindu family. But we must know that we are a minority in today's world, and that it would indeed be unwise for us to ignore the fact that for most Hindus, it may be more important to identify themselves as Hindu than as a cricket fan or a Stephanian or an IIM alum. Now, the question is, how do we manage this? It's unwise, clearly, to ignore the clarion call of religious fanaticism that so many desperate young men and even a few young women seem to have answered around the world. But these problems, which are also being reflected in our country, have to be addressed before they manifest themselves in ways that can deeply harm our societies. Of course, there's something precious and valuable about religion, but having a faith that allows a human being to see himself as one with others stretching their hands out towards God around the world. But can we separate religion from identity? Can we dream of a world in which religion has an honored place, but where the need for spirituality will no longer be conflated with the need to belong? Can we have a situation where it's more important to be an Indian than to be of a particular specific faith? If identity can relate principally to citizenship rather than faith, to a land rather than a doctrine, and if that identity is one that can live in harmony with other identities, then we can resist both jihad and mech world. If we all come to understand and accept that every one of us has many identities, then perhaps we can assert them all without necessarily attacking others. Sixth, the old binaries of the Cold War era are no longer relevant. There are no longer two superpowers to be non-aligned between. Instead, I would argue that the metaphor for today's globalized world is really that of the World Wide Web. This increasingly networked world, everyone connected to each other, multiple networks, some overlapping, some not, some with common membership, some with partially the same, some with none, etc. And sometimes the same, sometimes distinct. They all serve our interests in different ways and in different practices. If that sounds too abstract, let me illustrate what that means with an example. Our foreign minister meets every year with her counterparts from Russia and China in what is called RIC. Then she adds the Brazilians and the Chinese, and she has meetings with, Brazilians and the South Africans, and she has a meeting of what's called BRICS. Then she subtracts the Russians and the Chinese and meets with the others in what's called IBSA, for South-South cooperation. And then she adds the Chinese but leaves out the Russians and meets in BASIC for environmental negotiations. And India is the only country that's a member of all these four groupings, not merely because its name begins with that very useful element in any acronym, a vowel, but also because it has a useful role to play in each of these and it has something to gain from each of these. Now, that kind of worldwide worldwide web style of networking reflects other paradoxes of our world. Because India can play and is trying to play an influential role in the United Nations. We're looking for a permanent seat there. And at the same time, that's 193 member countries around the world, right? At the same time, we're also trying to focus on SAARC with just our 7 neighbors. Or we are a leading voice of the so-called G77, which is the global trade union of developing countries of the UN. And we're also a leading voice and an influential player in the G20, which is the global management of the world macroeconomy. Or we are a leading light of the non-aligned movement, which reflects our colonial history, and we rail against the Western powers for their imperial ways. And then we're also a leading light of the community of democracies alongside the very Western countries whom we're busy attacking in the non-aligned movement. Now, if these seem to you like paradoxes, they are, but they're not contradictions. The world today is this networked, complicated place where all of these connections and disconnections are possible. And that's why when I was minister briefly, I actually argued that India had moved beyond non-alignment to what I call multi-alignment. But I have to admit the phrase never caught on. Now, in our 21st century world, we are likely to spend a lot of our adult lives interacting with people who don't look, sound, eat, dress like us, okay? You might work, you can tell your younger alums or your kids, if you're amongst the older alums, that yes, you know, that's the world you're going to be growing up in. You might work for an internationally oriented company with clients, colleagues, or investors from around the globe. You're likely to take your holidays in far-flung destinations. Certainly, when I was a teenager, it was unthinkable to afford a holiday abroad. Now it's so commonplace. The world in which your children will grow will be full of all these opportunities. But along with such opportunities, what do we have? We also find ourselves vulnerable to threats we didn't have before, threats from beyond our borders. Terrorism, of course, but also transnational crime syndicates, counterfeiters of currency, drug smugglers, child traffickers, internet spammers, credit card crooks, and even imported illnesses like swine flu. So there are these trade-offs. In this increasingly globalized world, more opportunities, more threats, none of which existed 25 years ago. Now, wouldn't you want your government to devise policies to deal with such challenges that will affect your and your children's lives? Should such policies, in an ever more interdependent world, even be called foreign policies? No. One of the reasons that foreign policy matters today is that foreign policy is no longer foreign. It affects you right where you live. All of us want our governments to seize these opportunities that the 21st century world provides, while managing the risks and also protecting you from the threats that this world has also opened you up to. An example of the world actually seeking a more proactive role from countries in determining their own international contributions is happening right now, which is the current climate change discussions in Paris, COP21, which are still underway. As you may have heard, they were supposed to conclude yesterday, but they're carrying on because they couldn't agree. Individual countries were encouraged to set their own agenda for the reduction of carbon emissions by formulating so-called intended nationally determined contributions. So the distinction between domestic and international is less and less meaningful in today's world, where one is tied to the other more clearly than it might appear on the surface. For example, the effects of the China market distortion this year revealed how much the economies of different countries are closely tied, right? Not only has the value of the rupee dropped, but a ripple effect of the Chinese convulsions has been seen on the economic policies of many countries. Oil price decisions made thousands of kilometers away can bring down governments in India. So that's also hugely important for leaders to recognize. Seventh, this involves working for change. The dominance of a handful of small westernized countries or industrialized Western countries, because that's what they really are, especially in the international financial institutions, the so-called Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, looks increasingly anomalous in a world where economic dynamism has shifted irresistibly from the West to the East. With all of this and the emergence of new powers and forces which, unlike China, never found a place at the high table in 1945, we have clearly reached a point where there is a need for a system redesign of global governance to ensure that all countries can participate in a manner commensurate with their capacity. As the line goes, you're either at the table or on the menu. So more and more countries have had enough of being on the menu and want to claim a seat at the table. Now, this stands particularly true in relation to the new developments of BRICS. As I mentioned earlier, not only does the population of BRICS collectively amount to 2.9 billion, which is almost half the human race, but their collective economic output is about the same as that of the US today and will be on track to overtake the G7. So how do you leave them out? How can you look at a series of institutions set up at Bretton Woods in 1945 that act as if managing the world economy is about the rich countries supervising the sort of economic delinquency of the poor? That's not the world we're living in anymore, right? So we have to work to redistribute power in the international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, as well as in the global political organs of governance like the UN Security Council. You know, the BRICS have set up their new development bank with one of India's leading private sector bankers, K.V. Kamath, as the chairman of it, and they've located it in Shanghai. Very clear signal, right? That they are essentially offering an alternative to the IMF and the West-dominated economic institutions. It is simply not reasonable to run the world's premier international organization, the UN, on the basis of the geopolitical realities of 1945 rather than 2015. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council, after all, enjoy their permanent positions and their right to a veto only because they happen to have won a war 70 years ago. Now, it's difficult to justify any institutional arrangement in the 21st century by an event of history that took place 7 decades ago. For far too long, India has been a rule taker in the international system, but it's now ready to join the rule makers. It has the capacity, it has the experience, the track record, and the technology to play a major role in managing the global commons on everything from, on a wide range of issues ranging from cyberspace to outer space. 8th, the mass media is vital for today's leaders, but it is not enough. You cannot hope to succeed in the 21st century without the mass media. We heard this already yesterday in Shahrukh about social media. You have to know what's going on and at the same time what's on the minds of people, and also to project your own views and concerns to them through mass media. Any doubt that I might have had about the reach and influence of global mass communications was dispelled already in the 90s when I happened to be in St. Petersburg, Russia, for a conference and was approached by a Tibetan Buddhist monk in his robes, clashing his cymbals and chanting his mantras, who paused in his chanting to say, "I've seen you on BBC." New communications technology has shrunk the world and in a real sense made it one market, one neighborhood, one society, one global village, another cliche. But do not forget that the global mass media reflects principally the interests of its producers. What passes for international culture is usually the culture of the economically developed world. They control the global mass media. Yes, there's occasionally a third world voice, but it has to speak a first world language, right? So as far back as the first Congo Civil War in 1962, the eminent journalist Edward Baer saw a TV newsman in a camp of violated Belgian nuns going around with a camera and a mic saying, "Anybody here been raped and speak English?" So it wasn't enough for the nuns to have suffered rape. They had to have suffered and be able to articulate their suffering in the language acceptable to the journalist. Now that is the traditional reality of the global mass media, which leads to the obvious corollary question, can the internet compensate? In the West, perhaps it has become that, a source of compensation, because information now is far more widely accessible to anyone, anywhere. But that is not yet true in the developing world. I mean, if internet access in the US is at 92%, in India it's still only at 15%. So the stark reality of the internet today is the digital divide. You can tell the rich from the poor by their internet connections. So the gap between technological haves and have-nots is widening, both between countries and within them. The information revolution, unlike the French Revolution, is a revolution with a lot of liberty, some fraternity, but no equality. So the poverty line is not the only line that you leaders have to think about. There's also the high-speed digital line, the fiber optic line, all the lines that connect us, but which also exclude those who are literally not plugged into the possibilities of the brave new world, the networked world I talked about. The key to the internet divide is the keyboard, the computer keyboard. Those who do not have one risk marginalization, and as leaders, you cannot afford to forget them. If you recognize both the potential and the limitations of today's media, the 21st century could yet become a time of mutual understanding as we've never seen before. A time, after all, in which it's so much easier in the world to meet strangers than ever before, can also become a world in which it's easier than ever before to see strangers as no different from ourselves. So ninth and finally, each of you has a role to play in ensuring that ours is a better world for us having been a part of it. I believe that as leaders and managers, you have a responsibility to think about those who are not as fortunate as you around the world and in our own country. I've had the rare privilege as a young man of working for those who've lost everything, the world's refugees. When I was younger than almost, I'm certain, any of the young alums here, the youngest alums here, I found myself running the UN's program for Vietnamese refugees, the boat people rescued at sea and brought into the port of Singapore. I'll never forget one family I met and helped at that time. This was a young couple fleeing Vietnamese communism in a tiny boat. They cannibalized a tractor engine and put it on the boat, hoping it'll get them out into the international sea lanes. But sure enough, the engine conked out. They started drifting aimlessly in the South China Sea. They ran out of the food they brought. They ran out of drinking water. And they were essentially subsisting on rainwater and hope. But they had two small infants in the boat, a baby and a 1.5-year-old infant. So you know what the parents did? They slit their own fingers and made the baby suck their blood for nourishment. That's how the baby stayed alive until they were rescued by an American ship and brought to the port of Singapore, where my staff and I broke every rule in the book to get them out and rush them into intensive care, and then to see that same family a few months later, healthy, well-fed, well-dressed, heading out, embarking on new lives in America, offered the kind of satisfaction that few young people get a chance to experience. So I want to urge you all to know that it really is a privilege to be able to help other human beings. It's a privilege to put your head to the pillow at night, knowing the things you've done during the day have made a real difference to human beings' lives. That's a privilege that any of you, in whatever role you undertake, whatever business, whatever company, whatever NGO, whatever you do as managers and leaders, you can make a difference. Now, we're all like Egyptian mummies strapped for time, so let me pull my strands together. My basic point is that we have to think beyond world leadership and global domination to cooperative relationships in a networked world. Sovereign nation states will continue proudly to guard their sovereignty, but the world will inevitably push them together in ways that transforms the very definition of the word and dilutes its own meanings. That's the word sovereignty, and dilutes its own meanings. The ultimate purpose of any country's foreign policy is to ensure the security and well-being of its own people. The old autarkic ways of doing this, the self-reliance, the protectionism, the mantras we live with for so long, will no longer work for the reasons I've explained to you. And at the same time, the challenges the opportunities, the threats are all staring us in the face, and we must seize them. You know, most of us proudly belong to countries, I guess in fact everyone here is an Indian, or pretty much, so we all belong to a country that proudly and perhaps somewhat chauvinistically celebrates its Independence Day. The time may come when we realize that what we really ought to celebrate the rest of the calendar year is something else. The recognition that every other day on the calendar in our globalized world is really an Interdependence Day. Thank you very much. Have a great conclave at IIMBue. Jai Hind.
I think for those of you who came in late, there is this app. So IIMBue has made use of technology that Mr. Tharoor has spoken about so eloquently. So what you do is you have and download the Rabbler app. For him, the hashtag was Ask Tharoor, and I'll let you know about the next session. But here we go with the first one. And he asks, he says, do you feel technology will play a key role in 2019 elections more than ever before? Also, do you feel social media should be regulated? And this is so particular to you, particularly parody accounts and trolls.
Okay, well, first, yes, I do believe that that technology will play a greater role in 2019. It already did in 2014 by comparison with 2009. And it did in 2009 by comparison with 2004. And what is happening at the moment is very interesting, because I mentioned that actually our official figures for internet access in our country are only 15%. But what we may witness between now and the 2019 elections is actually little short of a revolution. If 4G becomes ubiquitous and the prices of smartphones keep dropping, you will find a whole number of people who would never presume to own a computer or a laptop or a keyboard, going on the internet affordably, cheaply, with easy access anywhere in the country on their mobile phones. And with that, you will not only see the kind of e-governance transformations we've been talking about, mobile banking, access to government services, and so on, you will also see politicians using this technology that much more. Because right now, every time that I use social media, I'm always warned by my party workers, remember, you're only reaching 15% of your potential voters, tops. In Trivandrum, it may be 10%. In Delhi or Bangalore, it may be higher, but it wasn't high enough for Nandan Nilekani. So the political realities of our country are that you do need to be conscious of the limitations of technology. But what happens when we come to an election where 65% of your voters are accessing the internet on their mobile phones? Then that becomes a principal way of reaching out to them, much more important than organizing megaphone rallies and street corner rallies and everything else. On the question of regulation, I am an old-fashioned liberal, Basanti. I tend to be extremely hostile to regulation in any field. During my other brief stint in the Human Resources Development Ministry, I rather controversially argue that our educational system is over-regulated and under-governed, and what we need to do is strip back some of the regulations. I tried, but the problem with it is that being an MOS in our government system is like standing in a cemetery. There are lots of people under you, but no one's listening. So I work for an India where we will really reduce dramatically the regulations, both in economic activity and in social activity, and as a writer, obviously, on freedom of the press. But you're right that there is a tremendous amount of abuse, and how do we deal with that? You mentioned trolls, you mentioned these organized hate campaigns. Shah Rukh Khan was talking about that privately also yesterday.
Right.
The number of people who are organized to attack somebody, you say something, and then they decide they're going to attack you on something else. And then 600 people are sending messages, all orchestrated. It may actually be 3 people sitting on various accounts, but nonetheless, all these messages come abusing you. All I can say is the answer lies in more awareness. The danger of regulation is once you give people the power to stifle the bad voices, they could also stifle the good ones. You give people the power to censor bad things, they could censor good things, things that threaten them rather than that threaten you. So my advice is don't have censorship, don't have over-regulation. Where people venture into criminal abuse and libel and so on, then the laws of the land ought to work. And there we need to do more to strengthen our judicial system. That's been another complaint. I mean, you sue somebody in our country and it'll be 5 years before the case is heard. And that is no use if you want to achieve redress. So we need to balance that also, but I still think that going the route of regulation or censorship is potentially a very slippery slope. I've always argued with our mainstream media as well, including TV media, which we were also critical of yesterday with Shahrukh. The fact is that, that what we need in our country is not less journalism, but better journalism, more professional journalism.
Cannot agree more with you on that. But then when on social media, one is glad that yours was, it was technology aiding you, especially that brilliant speech at Oxford on why the British owe us something. And
yeah,
that
I
went
spoke to 200 or 250 people, and it's reached about 5 or 6 million, I guess.
Millions, really. In fact, the next question...
That's technology, yeah.
Yeah, if you haven't watched it, this is just the hint. Now, the next question is, would border on the profound, I think. He asks, how do we look at and understand all the interconnections of our actions? This is not just as an individual, but also as businesses. I mean, the decisions we take impact so many. So the question once more for you, how do we look at and understand all the interconnections of our actions?
Well, if you listen to my speech, that was all about how to look at these interconnections. That was the entire theme of the speech, so it's too long an answer to give you all over again.
Just watch the video.
My sort of one sentence point of view is to assume interconnectedness, to always be conscious that apart from the obvious effect of a decision you take, there are various other effects precisely because nothing is happening anymore in isolation. Whether you're talking about a consumer or a market or an audience, whether you're talking about a country or a relationship, in every case, any decision you make, any line you speak, multiplies. I mean, look at my own, I mean, how I learned such a stupid lesson about interconnectedness when way back in 2009, when I was still a bit naive. This journalist asked me about our austerity drive and said, Mr. Minister, will you travel in cattle class? And I said, yes, in cattle class, out of solidarity with all our holy cows. Now, what was I saying? He had used the word cattle class, so I assumed he knew what it meant. I was replying to him, but I was doing it on Twitter, which is a medium that's open to the public and that can be completely, deliberately twisted and misinterpreted. So suddenly, this kind of Stephanian joke between two people who understood what the expression meant, that it's not insulting to people, it's an insult to the airlines that herd us in like cattle, that was completely lost, and instead, you had versions in Kannada and Malayalam and Hindi and Gujarati that made me sound like some sort of elitist, arrogant snob who was dismissing economy class travelers as cattle. And that was not at all in my mind. So I learned the lesson, a lesson that Shakespeare had taught us 500 years ago when Shakespeare wrote, the success of a jest lies not in the tongue of the teller, but in the ear of the hearer. So in politics, remember our country is interconnected, it's multilingual, it's politically diverse. And remember that anything you say innocently to one person in one place can haunt you in 200 other places. I know I lost votes last time because of that one expression. That's life. So
I think the bard knew what he was speaking, especially as a journalist. You have to, I mean, I would imagine you have so much to contend with selective reporting. Now, as a moderator, I have two questions to offer. You can take a pick which you do not want to answer because we have time only for one.
Okay.
So the first question is, in your book, you talk of the difficulty in...
Which book?
She doesn't mention.
Oh. There are 15 of them, but I'll guess. Okay, go on.
Yeah, you talk of the difficulties in bringing black money to India.
Huh.
This
India
government,
Shastra, my new book.
India Shastra. This government claims to have bought back 3,700 crore. What's your take?
Well, look.
The second question.
Okay.
I mean, you can take a pick which one you do not
I'll give you
want
short answers to both.
Are you the right man in the wrong party? I think we can also say both of the above, if you wish to.
No, I'm going to answer both. Simply, I don't like leaving questions that have been asked unanswered, so I'll be brief on the first one. And the brevity is simply due to the fact that what the government has brought back is money that the previous government was already in the course of bringing back on the basis of a list that had already been given, the famous Swiss list. So these names were there, and the procedures had already begun. They've been continued by the present government, and these people have come back. But if you look at the amount they brought back, there are 1.3 billion people in this country. You divide your 3,000 crores and tell me how many paise we're each going to get, by comparison with the 15 lakhs that Mr. Modi said would be placed in each of our bank accounts. So I don't know about how successful they've been in bringing back black money. I'm still waiting for my 15 lakhs. On the second question, and I'll take it seriously simply because it gets asked to me. I mean, almost no day goes by on social media without somebody asking that question. Let me stress that when I had decided to leave the UN, in fact, shortly after I stepped back from the race for Secretary General, it is true that every major political formation in this country approached me. I was approached by a BJP former minister in the Vajpayee government who came to see me in my office in New York. I was approached by someone from the left on a visit to Trivandrum, and I was approached by my own party, what became my own party. But the reason that I took the stance I did, even though those of you who are familiar with my paper trail going back over 30 years have published writings and know me as a fierce critic of the emergency, a fierce critic of the 84 riots, a fiercer critic perhaps of the Babri Masjid demolition and of the rise of Hindutva and divisive politics, as somebody who has attacked all parties equally and therefore would be presumed to be at home in none of them, the reason I made the choice I did was, number one, that it seemed to me there were three broad tendencies in our country, especially from the point of view of a potential Kerala politician. There are three broad tendencies. One is a group of people who speak in terms of India shining without really asking who India is shining for. The second is a group of people who say they're for the poor, but consistently oppose every progressive reform or policy that can increase the prosperity of the country and so permit us to have the poor stop being poor, because that would not suit their political interests. And that in the middle was a party that had given us the liberalization of 1991, had taken economic reform forward, but was still committed to social justice. Because I was very conscious, I had written this already, that the magic of the market cannot appeal to those who cannot afford to enter the marketplace. And we have a country where 70% of our population lives on less than $2 a day. It would be unconscionable to have a politics that did not feel a sense of accountability to them. That's why, by the way, I chose to contest for the Lok Sabha. Because I knew if I'd come in on a Rajya Sabha ticket somewhere, I would merely be seen as a government-appointed parachutist with no legitimacy to speak about these issues. And so I took the hard route. And let me stress that when it comes to these political choices, ultimately, there may be no perfection. There may be no party that everyone agrees 100% with everything about. You take a broad orientation. You say, these are the values that really matter to me and are non-negotiable. And if those values are present in a particular party, even if some other things are not, or some things are there which you don't like, you feel it's the best. I mean, at the United Nations for 29 years, I learned that you had to have ideals, but you had to pursue your ideals within the framework of the politically possible. For me, achieving things at the UN meant achieving what governments would allow me to do. And that was constantly having to compromise, but still pursue my ideals. Kofi Annan was a past master at that. Dag Hammarskjöld was a past master at that. Coming back to Indian politics, that was my approach also. I have to accept the political realities of my country, which I've written about from the outside, but which are a given as the part of the political reality here. I can't suddenly come in as one person with a totally different view and expect my view to prevail. I will end up with support that may be a mile wide with people like you around the country, but an inch deep, not enough to win a single constituency anywhere. So that kind of taking political reality and pursuing it was important. And as for this being the wrong party, the Congress of 2009 or 14 was certainly not the Congress of 1977, which I could not have voted for. There is a different part. Parties evolve. They do come up with new personas and new visions. There are good people in the party. The talent pool in the Congress party, and this anyone will objectively agree to, vastly outstrips what's available on the government benches today. In fact, it's slightly alarming how little talent there is in the cabinet that's been ruling us for the last 18 months, and that has so often looked completely out of its depth. So to my mind, I am in the right party. Whether I'm the right man is for you to judge. Thank you very much.